The first reading is from Exodus 1. When Jacob went to Egypt, he took his sons, and each son took his own family with him. There was a total of 70 people who were descendants of Jacob. Jacob's son Joseph was already in Egypt. Sometime later, Joseph and his brothers died, along with all the people who had lived at that same time. But the people of Israel had many children, and their number grew greatly. They became very strong, and the country of Egypt was filled with them. Then a new king began to rule Egypt, who did not know who Joseph was. The king said to his people, "Look, the people of Israel are too many and too strong for us to handle. If we don't make plans against them, the number of their people will even grow more. Then if there's war, they might join our enemies and fight us and escape from the country." So the Egyptians made life hard for the Israelites. They put slave masters over them, who forced the Israelites to build cities as supply centers for the king. But the harder the Egyptians forced the Israelites to work, the more the Israelites grew in number and spread out. So the Egyptians became very afraid of them and demanded even more of them. They made their lives bitter. They forced the Israelites to work hard to make bricks and mortar and do all kinds of work in the fields. The Egyptians were not merciful to them in all their painful work.
So this morning we are in the fourth week of our journey through the narrative lectionary. We started the first 3 weeks in the book of Genesis, and we heard there of God's covenant with Abraham and the ensuing generations, a covenant that had 3 central promises. One, that there would be numerous descendants from Abraham and his family. Second, that the people would have a land in which they could dwell. And then finally, the promise that God would be with them forever. By the end of the book of Genesis, the people are indeed numerous, and they have begun to prosper under the leadership of Joseph. But they have not yet found that land that they were promised. Rather, they're in Egypt, as we just heard. They have a special status because of Joseph's position. But as we just heard in our reading, much time has now passed, and there is a new king known as the Pharaoh who has come to power. And because of the long passing of time, he does not know Joseph and the debts that the people owe to Joseph and his people. And so we see here that the tide has turned, that the Egyptians have become concerned and anxious and worried about this growing alien population. And once more, the people are in danger. Now, we're skipping over chapter 2 this morning, but just briefly, it's a story I think we're pretty familiar with because we're introduced to the character of Moses, as we just sang some about him in our first hymn this morning. You may recall the story where all of the firstborn children of the Hebrews are to be put to death, so Moses' mother puts him in a basket in the river, in the Nile, and sends him down. And there, of course, he is found by Pharaoh's daughter. And miraculously, Moses is raised in the royal household of Pharaoh himself and finds a privileged position. Later on, chapter 2 tells us, though, Moses is out among the people, and there he sees an Egyptian treating an Israelite harshly, and he ends up killing the Egyptian. And as word gets out of what he has done, Moses is forced to flee for his life and goes out into the wilderness and ends up in the land of Midian, And there he meets a woman and marries her, and he now has a new family and a new profession. He is a shepherd watching over his father-in-law's flock. So that's where the story picks up in chapter 3 that I'm going to read for us this morning. God's people are still endangered. The Egyptians and their leadership are still anxious and fearful in treating the people harshly. And so now we begin to see God's work through Moses. Listen again for God's word. Moses was shepherding the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, who was the priest of Midian. He led the flock to the west, to the end of the wilderness, and he came to the mountain of God called Horeb. And there a messenger of God appeared in flames, in a fire that was blazing up out of the middle of a bush. Moses looked, and the bush was blazing away, but it was not consumed or burned up. Moses said to himself, "What's going on here? I can't believe this. This is amazing. Why doesn't the bush burn up?" Now God saw that Moses had stopped to look, and God called to him from out of the burning bush, saying, "Moses, Moses." And he replied, "Yes, I am right here." God said, "Don't come any closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for you are now standing on holy ground." And then he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob." And so Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. God said, "I have taken a good long look at the affliction of my people in Egypt. I've heard their cries for deliverance from their slave masters. I know all about their pain. And now I have come down to help them, to pry them loose from the grip of Egypt, to get them out of that country and to bring them to a good land of wide open spaces, a land lush with milk and honey. This is the land of the Canaanites and the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusite." The Israelite cry for help, God said, has come to me, and I have seen for myself how cruelly they are being treated by the Egyptians. And so, Moses, it is time for you to go back. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the people of Israel, out of Egypt. Well, Moses answered, "But why me? What makes you think that I could ever go to Pharaoh and lead the children of Israel out of Egypt?" "I'll be with you," God said, "and this will be the proof that I am the one who sent you. When you have brought my people out of Egypt, you will worship God right here at this very mountain." And then Moses said to God, "Well, suppose I was to go to the people of Israel and I tell them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me.' And then they will ask me, 'Well, what is God's name? And what am I supposed to tell them?' God said to Moses, 'I am who I am. Tell the people of Israel, I am sent me to you.'" And God continued with Moses, "This is what you are to say to the Israelites. God, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, has sent me to you. This has always been my name, and this is how I will always be known." Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Fear and anxiety. That's where our story starts this morning in the book of Exodus. Fear and anxiety, worry and apprehension. And I imagine we all know what those emotions feel like, don't we? Because no matter what our age, no matter what our station in life, all of us know what it's like to be fearful, to be anxious, and to worry about the future. In fact, fear and anxiety are so powerful they can often overwhelm all of our human communities and force us into actions we otherwise would not take. And maybe that's why this story from Exodus hits so close to home for us. Why this is one that rings true, because these emotions are so familiar, even in our day. So let me pause for a moment and ask us a question to ponder. And that is, what brings worry and anxiety and fear to your life today? Maybe it's a physical ailment that you've been struggling with. Maybe it's a family or a relationship situation that is causing difficulty. Maybe it's a financial concern or something about the future that's coming up. The list, of course, could go on, but think about what comes up for you personally. What might be causing anxiety and worry in your life? When I thought about that question, for me, a story from childhood came to mind. Growing up in upstate New York, my parents used to go back to Maine, to the coast of Maine, for summer vacation every year. It was a thing we did regularly, a regular part of our summer experience. And I remember when we get to the beach that we'd go to the ocean, and that far north, the ocean water was very cold. And so we would get those inflatable rafts that you could rent, and that way you could be out in the water and not be freezing until you were feeling numb. And I remember one summer day I was out on the raft in the ocean, and for that day there was an undertow that I wasn't aware of, and gradually it pulled me further and further away from the shore. And suddenly I looked up and I could barely see anybody there on the beach. And I recall being gripped by fear that suddenly it felt like I was out there alone, never to return. Fortunately, my father spotted me before I went too far and had to jump in the freezing water and swim out and drag me back to shore before I wandered too far away. But to this day, I vividly remember that emotion, that feeling of being lost, of being in a situation that is just overwhelming, that the fear and anxiety and how it can take over our lives and our emotions. In our scripture reading this morning, it is the powerful king, the Pharaoh of all of Egypt, we're told, who is frightened and anxious. And of course, there's some irony here, because the Pharaoh is the most powerful person in his nation. And yet it seems it's often the most powerful who feel fearful and anxious about the world. And he's got probably good reason to be concerned. He's looked around and seen that these people, the descendants of Israel, of Jacob, have continued to grow and to multiply. They were once welcomed guests there in Egypt, as Joseph had led them there in the time of famine. But now Pharaoh looks out and he sees these Israelites are a large and potentially dangerous alien population right there in the midst of Egypt. And in Pharaoh's eyes, they have become a threat to the nation's stability. And we heard it voiced when they're saying, well, what if there comes to a time of war and these alien people turn on us? We need to do something about this danger in our midst. And so, gripped by this fear and anxiety, Pharaoh falls back on probably that most primal instinct, and that is to separate the world between us and them. It is the classic good versus evil, insider versus outsider, native versus alien. And so Pharaoh attempts to deal with this fear and anxiety by enslaving the Israelites, by putting undue burden on them, by treating them harshly to make sure that they know who is in control. And so this first chapter of Exodus, as we begin this story that continues on throughout the Old Testament, it is a story about a religious and ethnic group being oppressed and terrorized. In other words, it's an ancient story that gets played out again and again throughout the history of the world. And it's a story that we still continue to see in the headlines of our world today. We know all of those stories about tyrants and nations who become fearful about an alien population and so begin to not only oppress them, but in some cases even trying to eliminate them and putting them to death. And so in many ways, this biblical story, even though it happened thousands of years ago, is very familiar in our modern world. It is a mirror of the fear and anxiety we humans so often feel. The oppression and the harsh treatment of an oppressed people still continues today. And I think especially as we gather together on World Communion Sunday, a Sunday when we specially recognize our connection with brothers and sisters of different traditions and language and nations, that we experience this ancient story as a reality that we still face in our world today. The second part of our Exodus reading from chapter 3 begins to answer the question, what is God going to do about this? To this people who are oppressed, to this Pharaoh who is anxious and fearful and possibly going to eliminate his people. What will God do? After all, the promise was made of great descendants that would someday people the earth and share the good news of this God who has come. How is the power and oppression of Pharaoh going to be resisted? And so this morning we read that familiar story of the burning bush, of Moses out in the wilderness tending the flock. And there he has this amazing revelation of God. Now let me say that we don't know exactly what happened out there in the wilderness. We're not sure how God revealed God's self. But we do know that this encounter with this burning bush forever changed not only the life of Moses, but the life of the people of Israel, as eventually we know he will lead them out of bondage. One of the popular interpretations, though, is that when Moses looks up and sees the burning bush, they are a symbol of the people of Israel, that Moses' own kinfolk are caught up in the fire of the Egyptian oppression and slavery. And yet the bush, the people are not consumed. And so many see this as an astounding sign of hope for Moses and his people, that indeed God has not given up on them. But no matter how we interpret this particular scene, it's clear that God is up to something. God has been moved into action. And so it is the unlikely person of Moses who is out there in the wilderness as a refugee, as a fugitive from justice. A man who has just run from his life from Egypt is now being sent back as the one who will set his people free. Now, to highlight the unlikely nature of Moses being the one who is going to be the liberator, of being chosen to battle against Pharaoh, I want to share a story I heard a number of years ago. Now, it imagines a kind of tongue-in-cheek scene where we have a pastoral search committee is out looking for a new pastor. And imagine it's like this. It says, a letter comes to the pastoral search committee, and it says this: "It is my understanding that you have a vacancy in your pulpit, and I would like to apply for the position. I can't say that I preach too well. In fact, I tend to stutter when I speak. I've had many different experiences I could share with you, but at this point, I am over 75 years old. As far as people's skills go, I do tend to lose my temper every once in a while. I also tend to want things done my way. And in fact, I can get a little violent when things aren't taken care of appropriately. In fact, I even once killed somebody. But since I know what a gracious people you are, I know that you'll believe me when I say that is all behind me now. In fact, I've only just recently had an encounter with God, and despite my initial resistance, I heard a voice tell me personally that I was the one to come and do ministry for you. One never knows when God will appear right before your eyes, and I intend to show up in a few weeks, and I'm going to lead you to a brighter future. And although I was a bit reluctant to work with you at first, I still feel that I'm being called to you nonetheless. Now, the committee member glances up who had read the letter to the rest of the group, and he said, well, what do you think? Can this person be our leader or not? Now, the rest of the committee, of course, is shocked and horrified. Who would want an arrogant, old, temperamental, obviously a bit neurotic man leading their church? Not only that, it seems like he's killed someone at some point. Was this committee member crazy? One member asked, well, who signed that letter? Who had such a colossal nerve to send this in to us? And the committee members, of course, looked keenly before he said, well, it's signed Moses. Because that, of course, is the story that we hear today. Now, even though Moses is the unlikeliest, perhaps, character to take up this mantle of leadership, we realize in the story that it's really not ultimately up to Moses, but rather God who is acting behind the scene. Instead of fear and anxiety, we hear God approaches Moses with a gracious and hospitable call. He invites Moses to come and to step onto holy ground. And remember that Moses at his core is a foreigner, an alien. He's always lived among people who didn't quite know who he was and where he never fit in. From his first breath, Moses has been estranged from his family and his people. His life has been lived under constant threat. And so the first act that God does here is to invite Moses into his holy presence in an act of gracious hospitality. And this is a pivotal moment because Moses takes off his sandals and he comes and approaches the holy ground where God has invited him. And he dedicates his life to a new purpose and to a new people. Moses is called in hospitality to lead his own people out of bondage, to lead them to a place where they will be welcomed and be at home, something that he himself has never experienced until this moment. And so just as fear and anxiety are common emotions that we all experience, so too is the need for sanctuary, the need for welcome and for safe haven. And that is what God is exhibiting today. Because we're reminded that each one of us is also estranged. We're estranged from God and one another, and yet we are welcomed back home. We are forgiven and made new and invited to step again into holy ground. And so when we see it from this context, the understanding of holy ground takes on a new meaning. It is not so much just a physical place where God invites us to stand, but it is a place where we are deeply and completely welcomed. Holy ground can be any place that we are standing at the moment. It is a sign of God's transforming presence in our lives. Holy ground is a place where we are no longer a stranger or an alien or a refugee. It is a place where we are welcomed at home by the Creator of the universe. And so it is with this powerful sign of welcome, as God calls him by name, that Moses is able to take up this new identity and this new adventure. And with God's help, Moses is able to step out, to free his people, to end their suffering, and ultimately lead them back to the promised land. This morning, as we prepare to gather in a few moments here at this common table, I want to invite us to a couple of reflections, to ponder two images. And the first of this is to think of that image of holy ground and to ask, where is that place for you? Where do you feel most deeply welcomed by others and by God? Where is that place that you know that presence? And the second question is related, and that is, how can we provide that holy ground, that special place for others, where they too are welcomed and they meet God in the presence of community? We think of that image, finally, of the burning bush. of the bush that is not consumed by the very power and fire of God. Whereto we see that call to a deeper and new identity, where God's presence flames up before us, where in the midst of all the difficulties of life, those anxieties and those troubles and those fears, where are we being called by God to newness and to new identity? Friends, as we gather together at this table, as we join together in holy ground, as we look for the fire of newness in God's presence, may God continue to open our eyes and our ears and our hearts as God's call of welcome and hospitality speaks deeply to our lives. And to that God be all praise and honor and glory this day. Amen.